The world was not built for different minds, okay? And if we think differently, then you're told to adjust. I'm Dan, the Neuro Man May, and this is where we change the system. Episode 1: Masking and the Cost of Being Fine. Nice to have you with me, folks. So, this isn't a self help podcast, okay? This isn't about inspirational slogans, it's about pure honesty from someone who is neurodivergent, like myself, autistic, and ADHD. Now, for years, I always thought that I was doing adulthood properly, behaving like everybody else, reacting like everybody else, working like everybody else. And it turned out I was wrong about that. I felt that something wasn't right, that not all the pieces added up. And for years, I struggled with my own identity. Really, I didn't really know who I was as a person. I found myself withdrawing more and more from social events and things, and not necessarily being sort of a social leper, but trying to regulate my own emotions. And little did I know that that would be linked to ADHD. Now, initially, I got diagnosed with what was then termed as Asperger's syndrome when I left university in 2009. Okay, and I was initially referred by my course leader, who initially said to me, Dan, I think you ought to go for a dyslexia assessment. And the reason she suggested this was because I was struggling a lot with writing essays. I just couldn't get my ideas down on paper. They were all in my head, all tangled up like like a spider web. I just couldn't piece them all together. I just couldn't grab that idea, take that idea, formulate that idea. It just wasn't working. Now, I knew that I wasn't dyslexic, but she said that doesn't matter. You can have other things identified. I thought, okay. So I went for this assessment, and luckily at the time it was free because I was studying, and I was assessed by a Dr. Julian Brown. Now, he ran through a series of tests with me. He made me write my own story. He made me sort of formulate my pronunciation. He asked me questions about my early childhood and the things that I found difficult at school. Um, he then presented me with his findings and said, "You have an incredibly slow writing speed for a person of your age, and your working memory is also incredibly weak," which would explain why I had difficulty with recall and things. But at the time, he didn't think to link this to ADHD. And to be honest, it wouldn't have occurred to me at the time either, because I was always advised towards the end of senior school by my LSA, Christine Drayton, who I still keep in touch with, that I could have traits of Asperger's syndrome. Now, they don't like to call it that now, as you know. They call it autistic spectrum condition. They don't like to say disorder because that makes it sound like there's something wrong with the person, okay? It's a different way of thinking, and this is what we're going to look at today. So, when it comes to masking, our body, it's like, to me, it's like curling up in a ball, and protecting yourself from the outside elements. Yeah, because you do see a lot of things as a threat, and you observe other people, you intentionally or unintentionally start mimicking their mannerisms, their movements, the way that they interact with people, because that way you think from an autism perspective that's going to be socially acceptable. That's going to anchor you and make you fit in. But there is also the ADHD perspective. When you're ADHD like myself, there is that fear of the impulsivity side. the impulsive side of our nature. What is it that will come out of our mouth today that we will have to apologise for tomorrow? That's the scary part, you know. And in life, it's about predictability, and particularly institutions, workplace institutions, they reward predictability. It's all about measured tone and calm authority. But I think with neurotypical people, the people who aren't autistic or ADHD, dyslexic, etc., they don't have or realise that predictability and humanity are not the same thing. You know, if regulation looks tidy, then anyone who processes visibility looks unstable, don't they? You know, they either labelled as bipolar, schizophrenic, you know, just not all there. They and there was a time that neurodiversity just wasn't linked, and this is the reason why I slipped through the net, because I appeared to be coping, I appeared to be functioning. There was nothing physically wrong with me. There was no physical disabilities, which is what it was all about being a child in mainstream primary school in the 1990s. So if speed equals competence, then depth looks slow. And that was one of the things that I also struggled with. I struggled with processing lots of information at once. Um, you know, as I mentioned previously, I was shoved into a mainstream school where I was expected to learn multiple subjects at once, change my mindset every 10 seconds to adapt to that subject. Subjects which, to be honest, I wasn't very good at, and I wasn't interested in. And that caused a lot of issues because when you don't have a label or you're not formally diagnosed with anything, to your teachers, you're classed as the difficult child, the child that they don't want to put the effort into help because they don't have the resources, they don't have the money, they're not trained in neurodiversity, they're not trained to understand the way a neurodivergent mind works. And yet at the same time, um, you know, they think that, or people still think that autism and ADHD stops at the age of 18. It doesn't. Okay. And I'm living proof of that. And there are other neurodivergent people out there listening to this podcast who will understand that and would have been through similar circumstances to myself. So you have to fight for your corner sometimes, folks. You have to broaden your minds. You have to try and think about what it is that you're doing and making sure you're doing it right. Now, having a disability, albeit an invisible one, doesn't necessarily carry a heavy burden. It can also make us more creative, it can make us more observant, but it can also overwhelm us. Yeah. And this is where masking comes into place because we are constantly on the edge. We're constantly overthinking, and then we're told off for overthinking. So then what does that do? That makes us overthink even more. So we do our best. We dress nicely. We articulate. We make sure that we're adapting to what's called the social norms of society. Now, from a creative perspective, my strength was writing, and that became the one place that I didn't have to perform. On the page, I didn't soften intensity, and that was also another way of me masking without realizing, particularly as a child, because that just didn't hide difference, that also hid creativity. Okay. Now, if most of our energy goes into performing normality, then there's not much left for imagination, is there? we find ourselves replaying the same conversations in our head. Did I say that right? Did I mean to say that? Did I mean to word it this way? Should I have worded it differently? Oh no, I've shouldn't have sent that email. I should have thought more carefully about my wording. I should have not spoken up at that meeting. So we're constantly monitoring our tone and editing ourselves in real time. Now, I thought that that was maturity. I generally did. I thought, this is just me being a grown up trying to, navigate my way around the workplace. But really, what it was a survival software for me. And it's the only way I know how to do it, even now. And unfortunately, even though masking does work for neurodivergent people, it also causes a massive problem. And the problem there is that if you're doing well, neurotypical people think that you're coping when you're not. So as you get older, your brain becomes very good at reading atmosphere. Is it safe to use sarcasm today? And believe me, I've fallen into that trap many times when I've tried to initiate sarcasm or tell a joke, and 9 times out of 10, it's never at the appropriate moment. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine about this recently, and he said, you know, you never really know what people are thinking or what's going through their minds, and particularly if they're non-verbal, which is something I've always struggled with. And I seem to be getting the very worst of it. I seem to be getting the misrepresentation. I seem to be getting misinterpreted by other people. And I always used to get told, Dan, you care far too much about what people think of you. You overthink things. You're too sensitive. In one of my most recent dismissals from a job, I was told I was overly critical. I made people uncomfortable, and that I crossed personal boundaries. Now, this is what we call the unwritten rules, guys. The unwritten rules in society. Okay. Now, no one never told us that the rules had changed. We were just assumed to have adapted with it. We were just expected to obey. Okay. Now, this isn't about defiance. This is about trying to interpret the intentions of neurotypical people. And unfortunately, that means a lot of the time our defenses are up, you know. And what tended to go through my mind, particularly in the workplace, was, am I pretending to be relaxed or am I actually relaxed? So by 8 p.m. in the evening, you know, I wasn't antisocial, I was socially bankrupt. And because I've been tired from masking all day, my emotions become heavily dysregulated. Um, I may have started either crying or getting upset, hyperventilating. And this kind of behavior to an outsider or a neurotypical person, you're just seen as either very intimidating or very frightening. They don't know how to respond to this kind of behavior because it's a coping mechanism, folks. We're trying to we're trying to express ourselves, but we don't know how to. What's a small issue to a neurotypical person is a massive issue to a neurodivergent person. Okay, and that's where this great sense of injustice comes into play. And I did a psychological analysis of myself the other day, and it was interesting because it said to me, you have a very low tolerance threshold, and you have this great sense of injustice. So as soon as you feel that, that is when your brain goes into fight or flight mode. And it's not one of those things where we can go, right, I'm going to wait till next week and then I'm going to talk to so and so about it. Your brain is going, no, this needs sorting out now. And I'm going to make sure that it's sorted out now because I'm not going to stop you from thinking about sorting it out now. Therefore, anything that you plan to do today, you're going to completely brush aside, and this is going to be your priority. And as a result, that can lead to misinterpretation, it can lead to disciplinaries, grievances, um, verbal warnings, all that kind of stuff. So you're painting a picture of yourself that you don't want to be painted. You don't want to be that person who's the difficult one, the person who's always seen as the problem, you know? And this is the cost of masking, folks, you know, and it shouldn't be the entry free to free belonging, you know, not for employment and certainly not for friendship. And so what would redesign look like then? You know, do we keep pretending to act like a neurotypical to the point of burnout? Or do we just be our authentic selves? How do we navigate that? You know, if eye contact wasn't moralized, if pauses were respected, if our enthusiasm or our innate differences were labelled as too much. And this is what neurotypical people need to realize, that redesign doesn't mean chaos, it means flexibility. Okay? It means adapting. And I used to get told in previous jobs, you know, this is something you're going to have to learn to adapt to, Dan. This is something that you're going to have to come to terms with. Nobody has ever asked the neurotypical person how they adapt to a neurodivergent person. And it's lack of awareness, folks. And I know that there has been recent improvements in understanding of neurodivergence, and workplace adjustments get put into place and things like that. But they're always put in very late, and by then the damage is done. And then we've spent all our time masking, and we've not been able to express how we're really feeling because we've suppressed all those neurodivergent burnout feelings, you know? If you've ever left a room exhausted from being okay, then I want you to know this. You're not broken. I always thought I was broken. Why am I getting so upset about this? Why am I reacting this way? Why are other people looking at me like I'm some sort of alien? You know, we're just masking. That is all we're doing. We're just masking. We don't shrink, we redesign. You know, we're redesigning ourselves because we feel we have to fit into society. You know, because we've always believed in the saying that people fear what they don't understand. You know, try being in constant fear as a neurodivergent person. Try feeling constantly on edge, worrying about upsetting or offending people without even meaning to. Living day to day, wondering if you're going to mess it up, whether that be in your job, in friendships, relationships, with finances, with organisation. You know, you can't just say that this is typical of every human being because it isn't. You know, and don't get me wrong, neurotypical people can live very happy and manageable lives, you know, but some get affected by it more than others. And this is important because I think this is why the system needs to change. We can't just shove everybody into one room and assume that everyone's going to cope because everybody is different in their uniqueness. Everybody's brain is wired differently. Okay? Now, I'm going to be doing this podcast week to week with 20 to 30-minute episodes exploring all these different aspects of neurodivergency and particularly in how it's treated in institutions, for example. Okay? Now, I have recently published a novel, Neuro Man, My ADHD Journey, available on amazon.co.uk in all formats. And I'm also part of the ambassadorship for ADHD UK. So if you'd like to donate, feel free. So far, I've raised £250, and my target is to raise £500 by August 2026. Okay, so tune in next week. I'm Dan, the Neuroman May, and remember, neurodivergence is our superpower.